Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co, and today I'm doing a Play This Not That between The Lord of the Rings the card game and Marvel Champions. Play This Not That is a series that I do on the channel, well, less frequently than I'd like, in which I compare two games, go over the pros and the cons, which games are stronger in one area versus another, what do I prefer, which ones do I recommend, both, either, neither, whichever it is. The goal of this is to compare two things and have you walking away with a little bit more information about which one might be a better fit for you. At the end of the day, if I like one more than the other, it doesn't mean anything more than my own opinion. But with that, what are these two games? We have The Lord of the Rings the card game, one of the first LCGs, living card games from Fantasy Flight, and then we have Marvel Champions. Now, Marvel Champions is more recent, although they have recently come out with the revised core set of The Lord of the Rings the card game. This basically has been out for quite some time. They have a revised core set. They're slowly launching parts of the series, parts of the thing, although the whole system seems to be cross-compatible from what I can see. And then we have Marvel Champions, which came out in, I want to say, 2019, and took the living card game world by storm. Currently, I want to say that this and Arkham Horror are the main flagships for LCGs for Fantasy Flight, the two current ones that are getting a lot of content. Although we are seeing a resurgence for Lord of the Rings, which never really died. This has been one of the most popular ones amongst a world full of other living card games, such as Warhammer and the Legend of the Five Rings and Star Wars and a whole bunch of other systems that never quite took off in popularity compared to, well, this one. But we're going to go ahead and compare the two. Brief overview of the games. There's a lot of similarity and overlap, which is why we're comparing them. But the basic idea of these is both of these are going to have deck building in them if you want, although both of them have pre-constructed decks as well. If you are someone that prefers a pre-constructed deck, they have that option. They have guided deck building, whatever it is, as you go through it. But you're going to construct your deck, and then either solo or with other players, you're going to dive off against the various threats that you're facing. In The Lord of the Rings the card game, you're often going on journeys. You're trying to slowly make your way through different scenarios as you slowly place down these trackers or these little tokens as you progress through the journey while trying not to die along the way. You can die if the threat escalates too far, if your starting threat gets to 50, or alternatively, if all your heroes die, then you'll basically be, well, dead. Along the way, you're trying to deal with various enemies. You're going to have your deck of cards. You're going to be drawing cards from every round, and you're going to be generating resources from your heroes. You're going to start the game with 3 heroes. You're going to be generating resources from those heroes that you'll utilize to pay for the variety of cards you have, from events to attachments to more allies that can go into play, different things that will help you out on your journey. Every single round, you're going to draw a single card, generate resources, and then go through a sequence where you start planning. You're going to be playing your cards to help you in a variety of ways, spending the resources you've generated. Then from there, you're going to deal with the threat aspect of committing some of your heroes, exhausting them to go on those journeys, and then deal with the threat that comes out from this enemy deck, whichever which will modify the various threat as you try to place down tokens on that and progress through it. Then you have the option to engage in some locations. Many of these cards are going to be locations that you can engage with and then pull them down from the side pool over here to actually go on these. Think of them as side quests, practically speaking, but they add more tokens you'll have to place down before progressing, slowly delaying you. But if you don't do them, then they represent this side threat in the background that will have to be dealt with. From there, the enemies are going to engage with you, attacking you, and any unexhausted heroes or allies can attack back. Rinse and repeat across, well, rounds of play until you either die or make your way through the journey, and that is The Lord of the Rings the card game. Marvel Champions follows a similar but slightly different system. In Marvel Champions, you're going to have your core hero. Again, you can have an individual hero, you can have multiple players controlling their own heroes. In theory, both these games you can play two-handed in terms of managing different decks or whatnot. But then past that, you're going to be trying to take down the enemy. This game has a bit of a reverse system as far as how scheme works versus these locations, in the sense that the main goal here is to take down an enemy, whereas in Lord of the Rings, there's no, strictly speaking, main boss character that you're taking down. But along the way, in Marvel Champions, the enemy, the main villain you're facing off against, will be generating little side schemes and plans and master things that are going on while generating various minions you'll have to engage with while being a threat in their own right. Along the way, you have to ensure that they don't actually accomplish their scheme. So as opposed to placing down tokens, you're trying to prevent them placing down tokens on a set of cards that they're going to cycle through, and you're trying to go through multiple versions, multiple levels of the villain, slowly but surely taking him down, dealing with his health over here, before either he accomplishes his own schemes, or alternatively, before he kills all the heroes. And that's what's going on with these two systems at a higher level. As far as comparing the game, to begin with, in Play This Not That, I'd like to talk about why I'm comparing these two games. And the basic idea here is they both have a lot of common DNA between the systems. And since Lord of the Rings the card game came out first, and since they have a lot of design overlap, I believe they share the same designers if I'm not mistaken, I believe they're built off the same basic framework while being different enough that this is a very different experience. But you're going to have your thwart, your attack, and your defense over here, similar to the way you have your scheme, your attack, and your defense over here. So 3 metrics on each hero, on each character you're dealing with in the game, both your starting heroes, as well as the various characters and allies you're going to be playing along the way. You're going to have events and attachments and other things like that in the 2 systems. In this system, you're going to have some extra upgrades that are more in-play upgrades that are similar to attachments, but not necessarily attached to your main hero. That's also because you primarily have a singular main hero. You'll also have various allies you're playing. Both of them, you're going to have minions that you're going to choose to engage with or are going to engage with you, and you're going to be trying to manage their scheme, manage their attack, trying to figure out how they're going to be balancing what's going on there and trying to prevent them from taking over in terms of their objectives, in terms of hurting your health or adding scheme to the master plan. Both of them, you have an overarching objective you're trying to be mindful of in terms of taking down the boss or going on your adventure, and while trying to balance all the tokens and assaults that are going to be piling up. They're going to have slightly different resource systems in terms of the way the games balance their resources. In Marvel Champions, you're going to be cycling your hand more frequently, but your hand is also the resources you're going to be utilizing. See, every single card is going to have different resource icons in the bottom corner that are going to contribute to the cost of the cards, versus in Lord of the Rings, the card game, you're going to be generating resources from their own pool, but you only draw 1 card per round instead as a counter to that. So a lot of general overlap at a higher level, while once you start digging down into the notes and the nitty-gritty, the games start differentiating themselves past just the theme. As far as comparing the games, price point first, this one's an easy one. Both games are exactly the same price. Obviously, whatever store you go to might differentiate, but if you look at your major online retailers, they're going to come in at roughly the same price, seeming to be in the $55 range right now, although that will vary based on sales, based on store, based on all of that, and that's in US dollars. As far as ease of learning and teach on the 2 games, for the most part, I would say the ease of learning and teach are very similar. They both follow a very strict flow of sequence that's easy to track as long as you have the little card in front of you. Both of them come with a learn to play guide and a rules reference, the rules reference of which you should eventually dive into to make sure you're playing it correctly, but you don't need to read it all before your first game. And both of them are, in general, they're just easy enough to go through both learning it and or teaching them. The one point I'll give to Marvel Champions over here is I find the symbology is a little brighter, pops out a little more, the symbols are a little bigger. I think that's just a graphical design aspect of how far back this was developed and designed. I think that in general game design and things like just the visibility of symbols has improved, and even though this is the revised core set, in order to be consistent and cross-compatible, I think they've stuck with their graphic design. But that does mean that some symbols are harder to see, some text is harder to read, blurs a bit more into the background. So in terms of accessibility to a certain extent, I find the Lord of the Rings, the card game, has a bit more frustration in terms of seeing small stuff, versus Marvel Champions is a bit easier to find that information. Not a huge thing, but worth mentioning. As far as theme, this is mostly going to come down to personal preference. Do you prefer the Lord of the Rings world, or do you prefer the Marvel world? Or if you don't know either of them, do you prefer, a fantasy structure or a superhero structure? And that's going to, for the most part, come down to personal preference. To me, the one point I'll give here is, again, to Marvel Champions, although that's because, and this might be controversial, because both these games are considered fairly themeless in terms of it mostly comes down to number crunching and trying to figure out the optimal way to make your way through a progression. But I do feel a bit more theme in Marvel Champions, which again might be controversial because I think this one's considered to be more number crunchy than the rich world of Lord of the Rings. The reason for that is because in Marvel Champions, personally speaking, I find that my hero feels more like my hero. And that's partially because of the choice to have a singular hero, that you're upgrading them as you go through the game, that you're playing cards from their deck and you're building out their pool, their upgrades, their assets, their allies, different things build more into the world of your hero that you have in this game. And so to that end, I feel a bit more connected, like I'm playing as Scarlet Witch, as opposed to me playing as Legolas, where I tend to feel it's just a card Legolas and not a deck built around Legolas. So a point there to Marvel Champions and theme. For the rest of them, I feel there is theme in both these games. Despite being number crunchy games, I do feel like I am going on a journey, that I'm fighting off the various villains that I'm used to from the Lord of the Rings world. I'm familiar with both these IPs, huge fans of both these IPs. In Marvel Champions, I feel like I'm dealing with the villain at the same time, and I feel the villain does have their side schemes, abstracted in both, but I do get the general sense of the world in the game that I'm playing, and while they are number crunchy to a degree, I like both of them, with a minor point to Marvel Champions. As far as art and components, again, personal preference here is going to be what it comes down to. This one has a grittier art style to it. I can see it being more appealing for the most part to a lot of people. But for me, it's again going to be Marvel Champions. I like the slightly cartoon feel. I've always liked superhero novels, and while in terms of I guess, any individual movie. I think Lord of the Rings is one of the most fantastic movies of all time, and I love the world of Lord of the Rings, and I like the art in this game, but I like just the popping and color a bit more over here. It's a minor differentiation, but a small one over there as far as art and components. Component-wise, they're basically the same. No major differences. It's a bunch of tokens, a bunch of life trackers, and nothing really else. Which brings us to the meat of the discussion, which is going to be the mechanics. The mechanics of the two systems, where I'll go back and forth between them both and give points to each one as I, well, mention them. Also worth noting here, I should have said this at the beginning, but I'm only, for the sake of this discussion, I'm only really comparing them as if you're comparing a core set against a core set. I'm not comparing the giant world of expansions and campaigns and all these other things you can go through. I'm focusing more on just what you would be getting if you played a core set, or the experience you'd be getting if you played a core set. And to that end, starting off the bat, the first point's going to go to Lord of the Rings here, which you might be thinking that's about time because all the points have gone to Marvel Champions. But Lord of the Rings is going to get the first point with the 3 heroes versus 1 hero. Now there is a bit of a trade-off there, which I already touched upon, which is the singular hero in Marvel Champions gives you the opportunity to focus more around that hero, bringing a bit more theme to life. But I like having 3 heroes in Lord of the Rings. I like having 3 characters that I'm building around, specifically and primarily for solo play. When you're playing multiple characters, when you're playing with either two-handed or you're playing with multiple people and you have multiple heroes in play, having Scarlet Witch and Captain America work together to take down the villain feels thematic. And it feels less thematic to have Scarlet Witch dealing with Ultron, or Captain America dealing with Ultron. I like the team sense that you have from the thematic tie when you have multiple heroes on the table. When you're playing the game, again, multiplayer is not a problem, but when you're playing the game solo, I find Lord of the Rings feels more like you're actually managing different things going on because of those multiple heroes, so I like that aspect of them giving you 3 heroes to dive into. The second point is going to go to Marvel Champions. The pre-construction, and this one's one where I think it's going to depending on what you're looking for, which is specifically the pre-constructed decks in Marvel Champion give you not pre-constructed, the constructing the decks yourself in Marvel Champions gives you a bit more guidance because of the way deck construction works in this game. You see, both of them have the option for pre-constructed decks. It's going to be a tie there, but Marvel Champions is going to give you a specific character deck that you're building around. So you're going to get the first 15 cards in your deck are going to be from the character itself that you're playing as, from Scarlet Witch. You're going to have her 15 cards, and then you have to augment the rest of the deck around that based on the various attributes, justice, aggression, whatever you're playing as, plus some basic cards. But that guided start gives you a lot of room to have the freedom of deck building, but with enough guidance that you understand a pathway to go down. Versus Lord of the Rings is a lot more open, which is why for me it's a point towards Marvel Champions, because I like this game a lot and I want to dive into it, but I'm not playing it religiously enough that I want the full freedom of deck building. Versus if you are someone who's really heavily committing to a system, Lord of the Rings, the card game, might get a point for you there just because it gives you more freedom. The guidance is great for a slightly more casual play, but if you're really leaning heavily hardcore, Lord of the Rings will give you a drop more freedom there. Next point is going to go towards Lord of the Rings, and this is directly related to deck building again, deck construction, which is the mixing of the deck types. You see, in Marvel Champions, every one hero has their hero deck. You have your specific attribute you're playing with, and then you have the neutral cards you're playing with. But you can't really mix attributes. You can't mix leadership and justice, or aggression and leadership. You can't mix the 2 different attributes in Marvel Champions, but you could in Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings gives you that opportunity for a bit more strategy, as you have different heroes with their different attribute sets, and then different cards, and then once that starts happening, you have the balance of having to manage each hero's resource pool and how they contribute to specific card types. So again, that might be a bit overwhelming for people who are looking for more casual deck construction, but it gives you a bit more freedom in that risk-reward payoff of managing different attributes, managing different resource pools, and trying to play them towards different cards, and giving you more freedom in your deck building, pro and con. So point to Lord of the Rings in that category. And then we have the card cycling in general. I like Marvel Champions more in the sense, and this is a point for Marvel Champions, in the sense that you go through your deck a lot more. See, Lord of the Rings is going to have you drawing a card every turn. Past abilities that will give you other opportunities to draw things, you're drawing a singular card a turn because your resources are coming from your heroes. Marvel Champions doesn't have resource generation from your heroes, although depending on the flipping it over to one side versus the other, your alter ego versus your hero, you might have stuff like that. But for the most part, your heroes are coming from your deck of cards. You're going to be getting a full hand of cards every single round. You can discard at the end of your turn, you can draw back up to your full hand, and then you use those cards both for the cards themselves as well as for the resources on them. The fact that you're cycling your deck more often, I like seeing the cards that I played. You can play through an entire game of Lord of the Rings and not see your entire deck. In Marvel Champions, you likely will see most or all of your deck. Now, it does come with a trade-off. It's going to have some consequences as you cycle through your deck, so you do want to be mindful of it, but I just like having more cards enter play. Lord of the Rings, once you get control of the battlefield, if you get control of the battlefield, you can find that your game starts progressing a little more slowly depending on the type of deck you've built. You don't have as much opportunity to see more stuff, to experiment with more stuff, which can also be punishing if the enemy's having you discard cards because your cards are fewer in, well, how many you have. So point to Marvel Champions in just seeing more cards and having more opportunities for powers and abilities, and it's going to get another point, again, for the same exact concept in the sense that having that handful of cards and having the trade-off on the decision-making around which cards to discard to pay for other cards gives me a lot of decision space that I find I don't personally get from Lord of the Rings, the card game. Don't get me wrong, both games have a lot of decision space as far as how to react, how to engage, where you assign your various characters in order to defend, in order to attack, in order to scheme, in order to deal with the various progression of your journeys. So there is a lot of decision space in both games, but that extra amount of decision space that I get from Marvel Champions, when I have a handful of cards, I want all of those cards, but I have to use some of them to pay for others. I love the tension that comes from being forced to choose between which things I'm actually going to use and which things are going to go towards paying for the other things that I want to use. So that's a point to Marvel Champions in the general resource generation and the way that that decision space comes around. As far as the threat punching back, it's going to be a point to Lord of the Rings. Meaning, in Lord of the Rings, as you commit cards to your journey, you have the balance and the concern that if you don't commit enough, it's going to start affecting your threat tracker. Any additional threat that comes from the cards is going to go directly to your threat tracker, so you have this aspect of trying to move towards your progression, and you sometimes want to kind of pull back and just deal with the enemies in front of you, try to attack or defend accordingly so you can stay alive, but the threat is constantly escalating behind you as you go through that, so that there is a sense of threat that's behind you, constantly pushing you forward, that you don't necessarily have from Marvel Champions. Marvel Champions is more direct in terms of you're going for something or not. It doesn't have as binary that option of pushing for something that can push back at the same time, and I like that sense of journey that you get from Lord of the Rings. Although the flip side is we're going to go straight back to Marvel Champions for another point, in the sense that I like the fact that there's a villain in Marvel Champions. Now, thematically speaking, it's very appropriate that Lord of the Rings does not have a direct villain character. It's more appropriate that there is this greater sense of threat around you, behind you, as you deal with various enemies along the way. So thematically, I'm not dinging it, but mechanically speaking, I like having a villain that I'm facing down. I like having a villain who I'm simply taking out the villain, as opposed to slowly making my way across a journey. Both are thematically appropriate to the games that they live in, but I prefer that sense of just dealing with a big bad that I have to slowly power through, that's going to level up and get in the way as I go through them, and I like that general sense of what the game is giving me over here. And that's basically where I'm at with these two games. As a bit of a wrap-up, both these games give me a lot of decision space, both these games give me a lot of card play, a lot of deck building, and a ton of content if you want to heavily dive into these universes. For me, I prefer the universe of Marvel Champions. I like the updated design. I like Lord of the Rings, by the way. I played Lord of the Rings way back in the day when it first came out. I never really dove down heavily into it, but I tried it, I enjoyed it, I had fun with it, I moved on from it, and then I got it back because of how much I've liked Marvel Champions. I wanted to see again this new upgraded set. Does it deliver? Does it hold up or not? And I think it's a good game. I think it's a very solid game. I think there are a lot of people who are going to prefer this. I think there's potentially a lot more strategy behind how you build out your deck and the way you progress through this. I think Marvel Champions is built to be a drop more accessible, although accessible in either of these is a tough word to go by because there's a ton of content for these games. Not that you need to dive down that rabbit hole, but if you want to, I mean, this is boxes full of content here because this is how much I've dove into this. Now again, it's worth noting as far as disclaimers and whatnot, that history is a big part of things in the sense that I have been more heavily diving down into the world of Marvel Champions, and that might bias my opinion of Lord of the Rings, because in Lord of the Rings, I've only played this core box. I haven't heavily dove into the other world. My overview is focusing on comparing the experience I've had playing both cores, and I have not dove into any campaigns yet in Marvel Champions. That hasn't affected my outlook, but it's possible that I've just grown comfortable with one system, and I'm comparing that system against this one, which, I mean, that is what this entire video is. But I like for me, I think the biggest thing, if I was comparing one thing from all the stuff I've touched upon, because there's a lot of small points back and forth that I'm looking for, but I think the biggest thing for me that has me choosing Marvel Champions for myself, and possibly for you, is I like the fact that you're going through your deck. I like the decision space around the deck. I like the fact that you see more cards. You have to choose and make uncomfortable, hard decisions around which cards to play. And I don't get that same sense from Lord of the Rings. I would say all the other points are small points of back and forth, but that's the big one for me. I like that decision space. I like seeing my cards. I like building out my characters and trying to figure out the combination of things that will work for me. And sometimes in Lord of the Rings, I feel like I'm playing the cards as they come out because sometimes it's all I'm able to do. And that's basically it. That's a play this, not that, between Marvel Champions and Lord of the Rings. If you like either of these systems, they're worth checking out. For me, Lord of the Rings is a 5 out of 5. I love this game. Not Lord of the Rings. Marvel Champions is a 5 out of 5. I love this game. I've slowly but surely gotten more and more into it. And even now, even the process of like picking characters out to just set up on the table had me like picking things as if I was actually deck constructing, even though I'm just putting stuff on the table for the sake of having stuff on the table as I go through the games. But I'm sucked heavily into this world and I absolutely adore it. Lord of the Rings is excellent. It's great. I have really enjoyed diving into this one. It is a 4 out of 5. It's one that I really, really like. And I like the sense of tension and the back and forth and the deck building. But to me, it's not Marvel Champions. It doesn't give me the same amount of stuff from Marvel Champions, despite me being a fan of both of these themes. I'm a huge fan of both the worlds and the IPs around them. Other games worth checking out are likely Arkham Horror the card game. Arkham Horror the card game is the other, like I said right at the beginning of this, the other living card game that is incredibly popular right now and well loved by many, and it's worth checking that out as well. In any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you found this comparison, this overview, this back and forth helpful. I think these are both fantastic games worth looking into. For myself, I prefer Marvel Champions, but both of them are well weighted and well loved by many. Until next time, have a good one.